Right, hi guys, and welcome to the first art tutorial that will be hopefully in a long series of tutorials. Okay, so the first thing that I want to go over today are the fundamentals, the first things. So that will be how to hold your pencil, how to create proper lines, shading. So I don't want to get too complicated yet, and we can build up on that over time. So it's easy to pick up on. Okay, so first of all is what kind of pencils you should use. Because a lot of people always ask, oh, what kind of pencil do you use? How do you get that dark? So the first thing is, I don't usually use anything darker than a 3B or softer than a 3B, because otherwise the pencils tend to smudge too easily. And you just touch it with your thumb, your picture's smudged. You can use fixative for that, but overall I don't go softer than 3B, and I don't go harder than 2H. I've been considering going harder than 2H recently, because when it comes to using harder pencils, it's great for laying down your ideas. You just sketch in very lightly what you're thinking of doing. You can move it around, and then later on you can add darker lines. Okay. Then when it comes to secondary things you can also use your clutch pen or mechanical pen. That's great for doing fine lines or details. And then when it comes to erasers, I have three kinds of erasers here. So there's your run-of-the-mill store-bought erasers, stuff you used when you were in school. These are fine, but this eraser is different in that it's a much softer eraser. It's specifically made for art. Okay, softer erasers are less likely to damage your paper. With these kinds of erasers, if you use them too much, especially on coarse paper, it tends to rub away the paper, and you don't want that. Well, you usually don't. Then there's a kneadable eraser. So what's great about these is they can take different forms. You can use them for fine details. Mostly I use them to lift out extra graphite. So let's say I do a face or I want to add a highlight, then I'd use this, and you can get in really small, really fine details. They're not so good for erasing solid lines, because as you press harder, it changes shape. Oof. Okay. So the next thing is I'm going to grab my HB pencil. Alright, so you'll see my pencils are sharpened in a very different way to what you might be used to. Okay, so usually I use a box cutter, but it's more than okay to use your usual sharpener. Okay, then you get just a normally sharpened pencil, although this one is kind of blunt. The only reason that I sharpen my pencils like this is because with an extended exposed area of graphite, you can get different textures and you get different line types. Alright, so the first thing you want to do, the first thing you want to do is grab your pencil. But there are different ways to grab your pencil. You can hold it like you're holding a pen, as if you were writing. You can hold it underhand, like this. So this is great for shading large areas. And then there's also holding it underhand but with your wrist turned up. So that's also good for shading, or for if your paper is at an angle. Then you work on that. Things you want to avoid when you're creating lines is creating hairy lines, or lines that are two lines that are opposing in direction but on the same area. Okay, so for example, if I draw a line like this, okay, so it has a starting point and it has an end point. And when we look at art, we can feel which direction the lines are going. It's kind of intuitive. That's what separates really, really interesting art from flat dead art. So you'll see in a lot of my old work, it's really detailed, but it feels very dead, because what I was doing was creating these small, short lines that had no direction. Okay, so usually people go like this. Maybe they're afraid that they won't be able to draw a straight line. Hairy lines are what this is called, and like I said, this is a don't. Okay, so you don't want to do that, or going in one line over and over. Okay, because then you have a bunch of lines that are going in opposing directions, and that destroys the whole feel of that whole area. So you want to try to use lines that are always going in the same direction, even if you're going over the same area twice. Let's say you want to make one part of your picture feel heavier. Okay, so let's say I draw a person, okay, and that's their hips, or they're standing. But I want to make this side feel heavier. Then you could go like that. Then you have all your lines going in the same direction, and it pushes. And then you have something come out that direction. Okay, so what I'm doing here, where this line leads into these lines, and these lines lead into this line, that's called rhythm. Okay, so you don't have to remember the term too much, but you do need to understand how it affects a drawing. Okay, so having good rhythm in a drawing creates a pleasing effect. It makes it feel like your picture is alive. It makes it feel like it's a living thing. Okay, so having a really detailed drawing, how could I put it? It doesn't matter how detailed your drawing is. If your drawing doesn't have the basic fundamentals in, it's going to feel dead, and it's not going to do anything to the viewer. Okay, so rhythm is one of those fundamentals that creates a more unique and interesting thing to look at. Okay, a unique visual experience, if you will. Right, so that's your first don't. Then another thing is shading. Okay, so first with lines, just focus on having single straight lines. So how do you do that? You can use your wrist or your whole arm when you're moving. Okay, so especially if you're doing circles on bigger pieces of paper, you tend to use your arm. Don't use your fingers, because when you use your fingers, your wrist has to constantly adjust, and then you wind up with skew or wiggly lines. It's much better to keep the pressure light and use your wrist. That's another thing that a lot of people make, this mistake that a lot of people make when they're starting out in art, or even if you've been doing art for a while and you just didn't notice, it's pressing too hard with your pencil. Okay, so we have pencils with different hardnesses, HB, 3B, 2H, and that's the best way to get varying degrees of shade and tone. Okay, so with the 3B you don't have to press very hard, and then you get a dark line. With the 2H, you're going to get a much lighter line. That's almost invisible. Same pressure. I have to press much harder. But the problem with that is it indents your page. So if you make a mistake and you erase it with the 2H, it's still going to leave a mark behind. And then if you try to shade that later, your page is indented, and then you're going to have a little white spot because your lead's not getting in there. So you want to avoid pressing too hard. Pressing too hard also will cause too much friction and add to the likelihood that you'll get a wiggly line. So pressure and your wrist. Then you've got great straight lines or curved lines, and then you can create nice little things. Great. Another thing to imagine actually when you're creating rhythm is to imagine that you're skiing down a mountain. I'm actually paraphrasing this from Mike Matesi. He created False Drawing, very wonderful book, and a lot of what I'm describing here, rhythm, is very much touched on in that book. It's not for basics, but it is something great to look at. So anyways, when we do shading, okay, so moving on to shading, essentially when you're starting out, you want to practice being able to control your shade. You don't want to have it too dark where you want it to be light, or too light where you want it to be dark. So the best way to do this is to practice creating gradients. And you'll feel that you'll need to apply different pressures with your hand to get different tones. Okay, so if I want to create this dark area, I've got to push a little bit harder or go over it more than once. And then you slowly move down and you lighten up on the pressure, and you don't go over the same area as many times. And then you get a gradient that leads from light to dark. So my gradient is a little bit, it's too much dark in one area and then just cuts straight to gray. Okay, that's one way to do it. So that is just simple hatching. Okay, so if we used hatching zoomed in, it looks like this. We can also use curved lines. That gives a rounded effect. Okay, and then there's cross hatching. So that's lines that go in two different directions. Right. Hatching, cross hatching. There are other techniques. You can use the side of your pencil, or you can use a blending stump. So what blending stumps do is they help soften the gradient. It helps to remove that effective line. So now, if you look closely, my gradient is much smoother. Okay, there are other things that you can do with the blending stump, but that's the basics, and that's the basics of it. That's the fundamental. But well, you won't be focusing too much on shading different things yet. Firstly, we want to get our lines down. Okay, so there are a couple of exercises you can do for that. So create a couple of squares. Now, of course, my square is not perfect, but it's okay. And then what you're going to do is create diagonal lines across the whole square. What you want to focus on is avoiding wiggly lines. You want your lines to be straight. It's okay if they're a little bit curved. The point is that they're straight. Okay, and you can create different textures. So you create another square, and then with this square you can create curved lines. Imagine that you're creating a texture like you're drawing a tree stump. Okay, my tree stump looks like crap, but you get the point. The lines are all controlled, they're curved, but they're not wiggly. They're not jagged. Right. I'm going to switch to this pencil because it is a little bit hard to see what I'm drawing. I apologize for that. I will be working on getting better quality camera and video equipment in the future, but for now I'm just using my phone. So yeah, these are the basics. Okay, so you don't want to create hairy lines. You don't want to create lines that are opposing each other. You don't want to create skew lines. So the best way to do that is to use your wrist to be light on your pressure. When you're creating gradients, I just want you to focus on going from dark to light for now. Okay, don't worry about creating complex things. Right.